ערב טוב, לדוברי העברית יש תרגום סימולטני, על מנת לשמוע אותו עליכם ללחוץ בסרגל התחתון על סמל הגלובוס או 3 נקודות, לבחור interpretation והיברו, ותוכלו לשמוע את התרגום בעברית. עכשיו אעבור לאנגלית. Good evening, dear guests, honorable ambassadors, survivors and family members. This evening's event was originally planned to take place in October, 80 years after the deportation of Danish Jews to Ghetto Theresienstadt. In October 1943, most Danish Jews managed to escape to Sweden in a heroic rescue operation. 476 Jews were caught by the Germans and deported to Ghetto Theresienstadt. We are dedicating this evening to them. Tonight is the 4th night of Hanukkah, a holiday that celebrates a great historic Jewish victory and a divine miracle of abundance. One small cruse of oil lasted 8 days, and the light of the menorah was never extinguished. The light of a candle is unique. When you use it to light another candle, its light does not diminish. On the contrary, it increases. And this year, more than ever, lighting up the darkness has special meaning. Our thoughts and hopes lie with the 137 Israeli hostages who are still in Gaza, waiting to be freed. We also share in the grief of the bereaved families. We will begin with the candle lighting. Reuven Robert Fisherman was born in 1928 in Denmark, the son of Malka and Leopold, who had 6 children. On Saturday, October 2nd, 1943, Reuven, his mother, and 3 of his brothers were arrested by the German police at their home. 3 days later, they arrived to Ghetto Theresienstadt. After several weeks' detention, the family was allocated space in a room together with 2 other families, where they lived for 18 months. In April 1945, they were liberated by the Swedish Red Cross. Upon reaching Sweden, the family discovered that Reuven's father and eldest brother had drowned while attempting to escape to Sweden in a boat in 1943. After the war, the remaining family members returned to Denmark. In 1972, Reuven immigrated to Israel with his wife and 2 daughters. Shani Shavit, Reuven's granddaughter, and her family will light the Hanukkah candle. You're welcome to join the prayers and songs. Shani.
Thank you. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו, וציוונו להדליק נר של חנוכה. אמן. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, שעשה ניסים לאבותינו, בימים ההם בזמן הזה. אמן. נאות עולם.
I would like to invite Mr. Daniel Shek Chairman of Beit Theresienstadt Board of Directors, to open the event.
Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Thank you, ambassadors and speakers, for your participation, and thank you for all those who have tuned in order to follow this very unique and special story of the Jews of Denmark and their salvation. And the story of those who ended up, several hundred of them who ended up at Ghetto Theresienstadt. I'm speaking to you today from the headquarters of the Forum of Families of Abducted and Missing Persons. It's a civil society-based organization representing the families of hostages and missing persons, and entirely devoted to these families and to the liberation of their loved ones. I believe that both ambassadors, if I'm not mistaken, have visited the forum, as have many of their colleagues serving in Israel in order to meet with families. The forum was created immediately the day after the tragedies of October 7th, and I've been devoting most of my time every day, most of the day, to this place ever since. And like many of the hundreds of volunteers who work here in very different capacities, I somehow find it difficult to speak about anything else except this mission of saving lives. You sort of you hear so many stories. You become part of this big family of hostages. So it's a bit difficult to talk about other things. So I think I will leave the salvation of Jews from Denmark to the specialists, and just say a few words about this place and how, in some roundabout way, it is connected to the history. Many have compared the events of October 7th to the Holocaust, to a Shoah experience. And although clearly by scale there is no comparison, there is something in the experience of one condensed day of such sheer systematic brutality, which has cost the lives of so many people and has wounded so many others and has caused the abduction of many others. There is something that is reminiscent. And although I'm not comfortable with the comparison, because the realities are different and the Jewish people is no longer the same Jewish people because of the existence of the State of Israel, there is something biblical in the enormity of this story. It's like a story from the Bible. Only in the Bible, these are symbolic stories, whereas on October 7th, it was anything but symbolic. It was very, very tragically real. So, as I said, although I'm uncomfortable with the direct comparison of the two events, I think there is something that has shaken the confidence of Israelis in what the State of Israel has promised to do, and not rightly so, because clearly this is an isolated event. It has not put in danger the existence of the State of Israel or of the Jewish people, and it won't in the future. But it has shaken the confidence of many Israelis and has shaken the confidence in the contract that exists between the state and its citizens. And as such, it will resonate in Israeli society, maybe not as the Shoah has, and it shouldn't, obviously, but it will resonate as an experience to be studied and followed up and hopefully learned from. And since, as Tami said, Hanukkah is sort of an optimistic holiday in the Jewish calendar, because it's a story of light and a story of revolt against oppression and the story of freedom and things like that. So I will end with a note of hope, first and foremost, for the liberation of hostages, of whom still there are many fragile people, but also the very fit ones need to be liberated soon. The stories that we're beginning to hear from those freed are not encouraging. So I'm sure you will join me in hoping for their liberation. And another, maybe a little bit more long-term hope, that maybe something good can come out of this horrible period, and that Israelis and friends around us and our enemies and regional players will understand that we cannot simply go back to what existed before, that there needs to be a real effort to tackle the conflict here in order to pacify this region and allow it a future of hope and prosperity which it deserves. Thank you.
We are honored to have with us the Danish and Swedish ambassadors, and I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador of Denmark, Mr. Thomas Winkler, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar, and for the delightful and optimistic opening to I would say to subjects which are dark and troubling. But I like the thought that we should be able to keep some optimism, even when we are in a situation as this, and when we're talking about a very, very dark period in the history of mankind. I will also confirm that both I, my Swedish, Finnish, and Norwegian colleague have visited the Center for the Families of the hostages and the missing, and we of course share the hope that they will all be returned as soon as possible. As you already said, when we started in the autumn of '43, Nazi Germany decided to deport also the Jews from Denmark, but thanks to an effort by the Danish people, they decided that they would not accept their fellow countrymen being deported, and thousands of Danish Jews were rescued from the horrors of the Holocaust. This is something we as Danes are, I believe, rightfully proud of. But this said, we should also remember that there are other issues involved. First of all, we should remember that this was possible because of the cooperation with from the Swedish government and the people of Sweden. The stories we hear, by the way, the Danish Jews were received when they reached the Swedish coast are really also heartbreaking. So I'm really happy that my Swedish colleague is joining us today. Secondly, of course, as already mentioned, we should remember that 476 Jews from Denmark were deported to Theresienstadt and did experience the brutality of the Nazi regime. Thankfully, most of them survived and was repatriated on the famous white buses of the Swedish Red Cross that we will hear more about in a moment. So again, we have something to thank Sweden for. Last but not least, and bringing it all up to the present day, the ugly monster of anti-Semitism, which was part of the foundation of the Nazi ideology, is reappearing, even in Denmark. Perhaps compared to other countries, anti-Semitism is not as widespread in Denmark, but it's increasing. and has been increasing for the past years. Danish Jews also feel the direct effect of the war in Gaza. The number of anti-Semitic events, episodes, statements is increasing, especially on the social media. This need to be dealt with, this need to be stopped, and this is something that my government is very much aware of. We have adapted what we call an action plan against anti-Semitism with 15 initiatives focusing on education. We can't get enough seminars like this. We can't get enough education, especially of the young generations, to teach them about the Holocaust and what happened. It's focused on protection. It's focused on specific reactions on anti-Semitic events and on foreign policy actions. Action plans are good and they are needed, but it's also important to speak out. We've seen what happened when people did not speak out in the past. And I will therefore end, and now I will look at my paper, by quoting my Prime Minister, Beit Theresienstadt, who on the 9th of November of this year, commemorating Kristallnacht, said the following: after the Second World War, we gave a promise in Europe. We Europeans swore that this should never be repeated, never again. And yet again, we experience episodes that bring back terrible memories of this dark past. Too many places in Europe, the hate is back in the street. And again, Jews are persecuted only because they are Jews. Even in Denmark, Jews live in fear. They take off the kippah when they leave the synagogue. They hide the Star of David. They keep the people home from school. It cannot be like this. It should not be like this in Europe. It should not be like this in Denmark, because this is not how the Danes are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would like to invite His Excellency, Ambassador of Sweden, Mr. Eric Uhlenhag.
תודה רבה. תלמיד לעברית לא מדבר, סליחה. Thank you so much for having me. Survivors, friends of a better word, I would say, that are gathering for this Zoom meeting. I would like to start with my deepest condolences to all Israeli friends for what happened October 7th. It's a kind of evil that is hard to describe. And as was said in the beginning, it's also something that is shaking this country fundamentally. And being a guest in the country, I'm trying to understand what's going on and how people are feeling. But firstly, my deepest condolences. Secondly, a very strong message, and I know that Thomas, my Danish colleague, thinks the same and said it. The hostages need to be released without conditions. Thank you, Daniel, and the forum. It was extremely inspiring to meet you. I think it was the week after the massacre. You had started your work. To meet families gave pain, but to see what you did to try to help others was truly inspiring. And that's also part of seeing both the dark and the light. That during this crisis, so many Israelis are trying to help each other and try to help people that are in need. And that's something that should inspire us as well. Going to today's subject, I have never been able to understand and will never be able to understand the evil behind the Holocaust. I've repeatedly asked myself the question, how could ordinary men and women become the perpetrators in the worst crime against humanity? I want to understand, but I need to try to understand. Try to understand and try to learn, but also sometimes get inspired of the people that did the right thing. We are speaking about what the Danish people did for their Jewish community during the Second World War. They actually made the opposite. The majority of the Danish people with the king stood side by side with the Jewish minority. and that's truly inspiring. There are Volker Bernadotte, Count Bernadotte, and the people behind the white buses, Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish hero, that could inspire us and could tell us that not all of us can be heroes like Raoul Wallenberg was, but all of us can do something. And my lesson when I look at the situation for Jewish people in Denmark and what ordinary people did for these Jewish people is exactly what should inspire us today. I think we have two lessons in today. The first is, and we're trying to do that, remembering the victims. It has been said before, but it needs to be said again. We are at a dangerous time in history when memories become history. Because it's so much easier to question the Holocaust. It's so much easier to distort history than to question when people tell their own stories. We have fewer and fewer survivors around us, but we need to do what we can to write the right history and to remember. Because if we don't do that, we deprive the people that were killed during the Holocaust also to be remembered. The second thing, and I would like to echo Thomas there, we need to fight anti-Semitism of today. In my own country, Sweden, around Europe, we see anti-Semitism. We see it in the United States for the moment. Anti-Semitism is a kind of poison that actually is a threat to democracy. It has been said before that it always starts with hate, or often starts with hates against Jewish people, but it don't ends with a hate against Jewish people. It continues with prosecution and hate towards other minorities, and in the long run, it's also threatening democracy, anti-Semitism. So to commemorate the victims, I think the most important thing we could do is try to fight anti-Semitism of today. Like Denmark, Sweden is, and the Swedish government is doing quite a lot now to try to show that the Jewish minority of Sweden is not alone. We see what's happening and we are standing by their side. Finally, I was thrilled to be part of the light of candling in the beginning of this event. To try to see the hope, even though there are dark times. To try to see and to echo Daniel, to try to see what could be done after this war and after the terrible tragedy to build peace in this region. To try to find the hope, even when you could feel sometimes that hope is not there. For me, that's Hanukkah. So I will end with saying thank you for organizing this. Especially thank you to Thomas, my great Danish colleague, not only for being a great colleague, but more importantly for what your people did to save Jewish people during the Second World War. And with these words, Hanukkah Sameach. Thank you so much, Torda.
Thank you. After liberation, some of the former Danish inmates of Theresienstadt continued their life in Denmark. They passed on the story to their children. With us today is Mr. Carsten Mahler, chairman of the Theresienstadt Association in Denmark. Carsten?
Thank you so much. I would like to start to bring a big thank you to Beit Theresienstadt for bringing this up and putting focus on the 80th anniversary. It's not a given. It hasn't always been that way. In 1993, the Danish Jewish community marked of October 43 with a beautiful book with 25 testimonials. There wasn't space testimonial from one of the people who were in Theresienstadt. Whether it was because people were ashamed of with some of their family members or guiltiness, it's hard to say. But many of the survivors, they lacked the recognition in order to overcome their traumas. In fact, it turned out for many of the people who survived Theresienstadt that they had to discuss with other prison camps who went through the worst experiences and trivialize the experience in Theresienstadt. So the fact that you are bringing on the situation and what they have experienced is important. The story has to be told. But it's fair to say that for the last 20 years, there has been attention on it. There has been a lot of good people bringing the story forward. And consequently, in this respect, there is a bit of light. Although the deportation to Theresienstadt is a black chapter in the Danish Jewish history, it belongs to the story of the flight, the successful flight to Sweden as yin and yang. The Danish society, from the king to the man in the street, constantly maintained an awareness and attention of its fellow Danes in Theresienstadt. For example, it was a church with the bishop Fuglsang Damsgaard, who, among other things, were involved in sending the packages to Theresienstadt. The packages was a game changer for the deported, and decisively it stopped the death rate of the Danes in Theresienstadt. And at the end of the war, as we will hear, the operation of the Danish Jews in Theresienstadt with the white buses, with volunteers from Sweden and Denmark, was at least as heroic deed as the Danes' rescue to the Danish of the Danish Jews to Sweden. The Theresienstadt story, for despite of its serious nature, part of a proud Danish and Swedish Jewish Second World War history that must be remembered. In Denmark, we still are blessed with 18 survivors from Theresienstadt, and several are still active in communicating their story. One of the active speakers is the former chairwoman of the association, Birgit Fischermann, who still, in the age of 85, is making lectures around on schools, etc. However, a few weeks ago, Birgit Fischermann experienced for the first time that a lecture at a school was cancelled by the police in suspicious circumstances. 2 weeks later, she was to give the same lecture at another school. Here, the school were recommended to remove publicly available announcement and information about the lecture. The speech was held in private setting at the school for students and parents. For the Theresienstadt Association in Denmark, is worries. We see lectures and educational initiatives as key to ensure the dissemination of the history, and several planned activity are at risk due to the current rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli expressions and a toxic environment. If this is not possible, one can discuss whether freedom of expression and freedom of speech also applies in practice to everyone in Denmark. For the same reasons, we appreciate the focus and the initiatives that are being taken these days by the government and in Denmark and in Sweden, as we also heard, to counter the rise in anti-Semitism and the insecurity for the Jewish communities in Denmark and Sweden. So everything is not as we wished it to be. 3 months ago, I told my children, I'm happy that you are living in this century. You are probably living in the century where the Jews has the biggest freedom. But 1 month later, we experienced what we all know about, and it can turn around so quickly, so dramatically. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the ambassadors for Sweden and for Denmark, for the great commitment and the rescue of the Danish Jews in Theresienstadt. Without this, it would certainly be doubtful if I, as a second generation survivor, would be here today. So happy Hanukkah, Hanukkah Sameach. We feel for all the ones who need to find the light again.
Vi ankom til Theresienstadt og blev lukket ind i en stor hal, som hed Sløjsen. Jeg erindrer de lange borde med soldater, som sad ned på nogle stole, og så skulle man så stå der og fortælle, hvem man var, og om man havde nogen.
Så blev vi så ført ind i en stor bygning, så vi så var en kaserne, og der skulle vi bare sidde og vente på jorden. Og så begyndte de at fortælle om forholdene. Vi var nået til en by, der hed Theresienstadt, og de fortalte så, at vi skulle have rationeringsmærker, vi skulle have en jødestjerne. De fortalte, at en jødestjerne skulle sidde med alle 6 takker synlige. Det er sådan, at mit transportnummer, det er en væsentlig del af min identitet. Jeg er Jytte Bornstein, XXV-3-129.
Alle os kom så til at bo i nogle bygninger, som var store kaserner med store sovesale, hvor man var i en 3 ugers tid, indtil tyskerne fandt ud af, hvor de skulle gøre af os. Vi blev placeret på et loft på en af kasernerne, og der lå vi på sådan nogle hylder på noget halm, der var fyldt med lus og lopper.
Dr. Orna Keren-Carmel is a historian from modern Scandinavia. Her PhD, titled The Rescue of Danish Jewry in Israeli Historiography and Culture of Memory, 1943 to 2013, was written at Tel Aviv University. Her lecture will be about saving the Jews of Denmark, also in Ghetto Theresienstadt.
Thank you very much, Tammy and Beit Theresienstadt, for inviting me to this important conference. I would like also to thank the 2 ambassadors, Ambassador Ullenhau, which is a great honor to have you with us today. I know that in the last few years, I came to know your personal, not only professional commitment to commemorate the Holocaust, and furthermore, to try and reveal its relevance to our own present time. So thank you. And Ambassador Winkler, welcome to Israel. That's about all the Danish I know. But usually it's a little more relaxed here in the country. So sorry for that. Today, actually, I have 2 important points I wish to emphasize, which are often neglected in the rescue story of October 1943. I will start, with your permission, with a very short introduction of this extraordinary rescue. Then I will outline the remarkable way this rescue was commemorated in Israeli Holocaust memory along the years. And finally, I will present a quite unfamiliar explanation to this rescue, which derives from my doctoral research on the subject, as Tammy said, and which lately gains a considerable international attention. So let's start. On April 9, 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Denmark. 3 years later, on the Jewish New Year's Day of 1943, the night between October 1st and 2nd, the Germans set the date for the deportation of Danish Jews to Theresienstadt. The reaction of the Danes was not only unusual, but also unprecedented. A popular uprising began. Ordinary Danes, policemen, postmen, doctors, drivers, teachers, priests, they all spread the news, and many also helped the Jews to escape and find hiding places. Thanks to this popular support, almost all Danish Jews managed to take shelter and later move to neutral Sweden. Approximately 7,200 Jews and another 700 non-Jewish family members crossed in boats the Öresund, which is the maritime strait between Denmark and Sweden, and arrived at the Swedish safe haven. Thus, over 94% of Danish Jews were saved. But not all Jews were saved. The Germans managed to capture 482 Jews who were sent to Theresienstadt, which was a transit camp that housed during the war a total of 160,000 prisoners, of whom 88,000, about a half, were sent to extermination camps in the east, mainly to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Some of the Danish Jewish prisoners that ended up in Theresienstadt were Jews who have lived in Denmark for many generations. They're called the Jewish Vikings. Some were Jews who came from Russia following the pogroms at the beginning of the 20th century. And some were young members of Zionist pioneering organizations who came to Denmark during the 1930s. It is interesting to note that the percentage of the members of the young Zionist pioneers that arrived in Theresienstadt was actually much higher than the relative share in the Jewish community in Denmark, almost double. About 8% of all Jews in Denmark were Zionist pioneers, but in Theresienstadt, they made up 14% of the Danish prisoners. This is because in some cases, the young pioneers lived in remote and isolated farms throughout Denmark, and therefore did not receive the warning about the upcoming deportation of the Jews in due time. The arrival of the Danish Jews to Theresienstadt was actually the only point of contact between Denmark and the Holocaust throughout the Second World War. In the ghetto itself, the Danish Jewish prisoners met tens of thousands of Jews from different countries and endured together with them the harsh conditions that prevailed in the ghetto. Constant cold, hunger, family splits, harsh and overcrowded living conditions, uncertainty, depression, and of course, high rates of death. But interestingly, all the interviews conducted with Danish Jews who survived the Theresienstadt ghetto are connected and at the same time clearly distinguished from interviews with Theresienstadt survivors from other countries. In what sense? In their emphasis on the preferential treatment that Danish Jews enjoyed during their stay in Theresienstadt, and that in contrast to prisoners from other countries. Starting in 1944, the Jewish prisoners from Denmark began to receive packages with clothing and food, at first through private organization and the Danish state, and starting July 1944, also through the Red Cross. In all their interviews, it's very much emphasized how these packages improved their lives, and no less important than that, proved to them that Denmark has not forgotten or abandoned them. Now, how was the rescue in Denmark commemorated in Israel along the years? Well, the Israeli culture of memory has presented the rescue in Denmark as a positive example that proved the mainly negative reactions of other European countries to the extermination of the Jews during the Holocaust. What does it exactly mean? It means that the Danish people were presented as a ray of light in the darkness of the Holocaust, or as an exception that testifies to the rule. The implicit assumption was that those countries who wanted to save the Jews, such as Denmark, could. The rest of the countries just didn't care enough. Mainly because of this representation, the special circumstances that actually enabled the rescue in Denmark, both from the German side and from the Danish side, they had no place in the shaping of the rescue story in Israel. And quite early, it became a myth. In 1963, 3 trees were planted in Yad Vashem to commemorate the rescue in honor of the Danish people, the Danish underground, and the Danish king, Christian X. And until today, it is taught in schools, though very, very briefly, celebrated in ceremonies and commemorated in public sites, among others in Denia Square in Jerusalem, in the Denmark High School in Jerusalem, in Denmark Square in Haifa, and more. Indirectly, this myth also affected how the rescued Danish Jews were seen in Israel. For many years, they were looked upon like sheep that was led to safety. And this is actually in contrast to the concept of Jews that went like sheep to slaughter. So in other words, is completely passive victims of the rescue. The Danes, on the other hand, were presented as heroes, as those who warned them, hid them, provided them with food and clothing, and finally also sailed them to Sweden. But in recent decades, a fundamental change has taken place in the status of survivors in Israeli society. And the figure of the survivor as an individual and not as a collective part of a group began to stand out. Indeed, when you focus on the details, you find that the vast majority of Danish Jews spread themselves the warning about the impending deportation, left their homes within a few hours, found hiding places, and many of them also financed the cost of the transportation to Sweden themselves. So, when you focus on the survivor and his or her unique story, and not on the survivor as a part of a group of survivors, new revelations surface. It turns out that most of the Danish Jews were very active during their escape, and that they were helped by the Danes in some cases, but not in all. Now, after presenting to you the way that this rescue was commemorated in Israel along the years, as we said, a light in the darkness, I would like to offer you an explanation, at least partially, to its remarkable historical uniqueness. How come that the rescue in Denmark was so successful? Why didn't it happen in other countries as well? Now, I claim that the unprecedented success of the rescue of Danish Jews, beyond the historical circumstances in which it took place, and are of course very important, is the result of the coinciding shaping of the Nordic welfare state at the time. Since the arrival of the first Jew in Denmark, it was in 1622, the Danish king and the Danish government have been the protectors of the Jews. During these 401 years, anti-Semitism in Denmark was present, and not necessarily as a marginal phenomenon, but it was never directed from above, from the heads of states. Now, since the end of the 19th century, Denmark, like the other Nordic countries, began to shape itself as a welfare state. This process reached its peak exactly during the 1930s, when important steps were taken towards building a universalistic welfare state with a high degree of social planning. One of the main values that have guided the Nordic welfare state from then and until today is related to the increased responsibility that the state has towards its citizens. The state needs to be strong and active in order to succeed in protecting its citizens from the uncertainty of life. The rescue of the Danish Jews in October 1943 is probably the best example of this. The Danish government was unable to prevent the Nazi deportation of the Jews from Denmark, but the Danish authorities saw their role both before and after the deportation to protect them. And this led Denmark to consistently oppose the Germans' attempts to harm the rights of the Jewish minority. In that sense, once you're part of the state community, the state will go above and beyond for you. Accordingly, the Danish welfare state treated its Jewish citizens in the exact same way as it treated the Jewish refugees who entered Denmark before and during the war, although the latter were in fact without any civic rights. This is an important point. On the other hand, this approach also explains, if only partially, the very restrictive policy of the Danes and the Swedes in the 1930s to grant asylum to persecuted Jews. The welfare state mainly cares for its own citizens, not for the citizens of other countries. It emphasizes the mutual responsibility between the citizens and the state, while setting clear boundaries between those who are part of the community and those who are not. And this is very visible until today. Now, here are 7 very short examples that testify to my claim about the close connection between the success of the rescue of Danish Jews and the Nordic welfare state. 1. Already in the agreement signed by the Danish government with Nazi Germany in April 1940, right after the surrender, the Danes stated that they would oppose any legislation that would harm the rights of its Jewish minority. This protection of minority rights was a clear statement of intent. 2. The Danish authorities were deeply concerned for the Jewish prisoners in Theresienstadt, as I've already mentioned before. The Danes sent packages with food, vitamins, and clothing to all the Jewish prisoners in Theresienstadt until they succeeded to release them in April 1945 with the White Buses operation, of which we'll very shortly hear. 3. After the deportation of the Jews to Theresienstadt in October, the Danish government signed an agreement with Adolf Eichmann, the German who was responsible for the final solution of the Jews, according to which the Danish Jewish prisoners would remain in Theresienstadt and not be transferred further to Auschwitz. It was actually the only country in Europe that managed to get Adolf Eichmann to sign such an agreement, and beyond that, also make sure that he abides by it. In addition, the Danes were the only ones who insisted and succeeded in visiting their Jewish prisoner in Theresienstadt, and did so during their famous visit there in June 1944. 4. Even after the escape to Sweden, the Danish authorities continued to take care of the rights of the fleeing Jews. The Danish Ministry of Welfare, for example, locked up the abandoned apartments of the Jews, stored their property, and at the end of the war managed to return most of it to the Jewish tenants who had returned from Sweden or from Theresienstadt. 5. Denmark was the only country in Europe that immediately upon the return of the Jews at the end of the war paid them on its own initiative compensation for the economic losses they incurred during it, without the need to involve legal courts. That is why the question of compensation never came up in Denmark. 6. The strong universalistic welfare state, or as the Swedes called it at the time, the people's home, can also be identified in Sweden's conduct towards the Jewish refugees. The Swedes invested enormous rehabilitation efforts in regard to the fleeing Jews of Denmark and Norway, as well as in the many refugees who came to Sweden after the war. Today, it is often claimed that the experience that Sweden gained during the rehabilitation of refugees right after the Second World War is what made it, in many ways, not only a practical and better welfare state, but also a more moral state with a strong commitment to refugees to this day. And 7, the last one, the White Buses operation, which was Scandinavian, with the Scandinavian prisoners actually came back at the end of the war, was a very complex cooperation and that required a lot of planning and resources. It's not surprising, therefore, that only together the 3 welfare states, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, succeeded in carrying out such an operation. So, to sum up, The explanation for the success of the rescue of the majority of Danish Jews lies in the attitude of the welfare state towards its Jewish minority, an attitude from above, the government and the state authorities, which consequently influenced many of its citizens. The majority of Danes who helped to hide and transport the Jews to Sweden didn't come from the ranks of the Danish underground, nor did they join the underground afterwards. In other words, most of the Danes who helped the Jews did so more out of a desire to preserve the democratic and universalist character of Denmark than as an act of resistance to the Nazi occupation. In this sense, it's a rescue that actually came from above and not, as is often claimed, a rescue from below, from the people. Of course, it wouldn't have been possible without the individuals who along the way helped the Jews, this is for sure, but it is the Danish and the Swedish democratic and universalist welfare states that stood firmly behind this unprecedented rescue. And this lesson about the importance of the strong state that sees its role in taking care, in the full sense of the word, of the rights of its citizens and their protection, and which has efficient and comprehensive means to do so, and which is not afraid to take a clear moral stand in times of need, this lesson should be remembered today in our own troubled time. Thank you.
Thank you, Orna.
I februar 1945 forhandler Folke Bernadotte fra det svenske Røde Kors med den nazistiske ledelse i Berlin om frigivelsen af skandinaviske fanger fra KZ-lejre i det besatte Europa. Den 13. april 1945 får de danske fanger besked om at gøre sig klar til at forlade Theresienstadt.
Der sker det, at mens jeg sidder ude og arbejder i Glemmer en dag, så kommer der en, jeg ved ikke hvem, men der går rygter om, at danskerne skal hjem til Danmark. Vi snakkede om det, og vi blev enige om, at det kunne nok ikke passe. Det var nok nogle rygter.
Så fik vi besked om, at vi skulle samles i jægerkaserne, medbringende bagage. Sådan et stykke papir fik alle, når de skulle i transport. Så vi vidste jo reelt ikke, om det var fordi vi skulle hjem, eller om vi skulle i transport.
Vi fik besked på, at vi skulle pakke alle vores ejendele af det, vi havde.
Og så fik jeg pakket nogle småting sammen. Og så om aftenen gik vi over på den kaserne, hvor vi skulle mødes. Så den nat, vi sad på den kaserne og ventede på de hvide busser, der gik jo mange rygter. Og vi var hundenervøse og anspændte alle sammen. Så den ene historie var jo værre end den anden.
Og nogen sagde, at de vidste, at de skulle hjem. Andre sagde, at vi skulle andre steder hen. Vi vidste jo ikke, hvor vi skulle hen.
Så skete der jo noget hen under morgenstunden, hvor der stod nogen og råbte, der er nogle hvide busser. De hvide busser er her.
Dr. Dov Levitan was born in Denmark. He's a senior lecturer at Ashkelon Academic College and serves as head of the Multidisciplinary Social Sciences Department at the college. He published a book on Denmark-Israel relations upon the establishment of the State of Israel, which was published by Copenhagen University Press. Dr. Levitan's lecture will be about the white buses and is dedicated to his uncles, Sila and Bernhard Cohen, who were deported from Copenhagen to Theresienstadt in October 1943. They survived and returned to Copenhagen in the White Buses operation. דוב, בבקשה.
Thank you. Good evening, Chanukah Sameach. Operation White Buses is an outstanding humanitarian operation which aimed to release Norwegian and Danes from concentration camps and jails in Germany. However, there was also a byproduct. Altogether, we speak about the release about 15,000 people, a little above it, half of it Norwegian and Danes, and half of them of other nationalities, mainly women from the female concentration camp of Ravensbrück, most of them Jewish. They were transferred in the beginning to the Neuengamme camp, as we very soon shall go a little into the details, and they were taken care by the Red Cross. Some of them were afterwards transferred by buses to Denmark and to Sweden, and others by vessels from Lübeck to Sweden. And the first question I would like to raise here is, to whom should we address our gratitude, our appreciation? To the Swedish ambassador, Mr. Ullenhag, or maybe to the Danish one, to Mr. Winkler, or to both of them? Or maybe someone will say, don't do it. I hope that during my lecture, I should be able to provide you with an answer, at least with my answer. Well, 6 weeks after the war had concluded, Count Folke Bernadotte, Swedish count, who led the operation, the rescue operation, published a book in Swedish. It's called Sluttet. It became a bestseller. It was also translated to Danish and to a number of other languages. And actually, he said this was an operation which could be carried out due to my humanitarian negotiations in Germany, mainly with Himmler, and also the Swedish resources which were recruited for this operation. So this became the Swedish narrative, should we say, in the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s. We also have to remember that the rescue personnel was mainly Swedish volunteers, mostly from the army, and the equipment was also Swedish. However, there's another narrative, and the other narrative is so important for the issue that we are dealing with here, with the issue of the rescue of the Danish Jew from Theresienstadt. Because the Danes said, listen, you also have to share the recognition with us. This was a mixed rescue operation. We, the Danes, started to rescue people already in the end of 44, before the Swedes, came into the picture. And that was despite the fact that Denmark was under German occupation. One thing more which has to be remembered is, in the middle of the time period, we speak mainly about the months March and April, half of the Swedish personnel returned to Sweden, and they were replaced by Danes. So most of the rescuers were Danes. That is the Danish narrative, and I would like to go a little more into the depths. However, it's important to point out that in July 1945, it means a few months after the war had concluded, a group of Danish high-ranked senior officials got together and they decided not to object and not to challenge the Swedish narrative. And they had their reasons. One of the reasons was they wanted to show gratitude. However, Sweden had helped Denmark during the war with the Danish Jews, with the there were people from members of the resistance who fled to Sweden, and then also there were very close relations between the Danish royal family and the Swedish royal family. But the Danes always claimed, listen, we have to remember, we were there, and we were there especially when we are dealing with the issue of the rescue of the Jews from Theresienstadt. Now, as Tammy said, I want to dedicate my lecture to my aunt and my uncle, Silla and Bernhard Kohn, who were among those who were not lucky enough to be rescued by the Danes and were not able to flee to Sweden, and they were deported to Theresienstadt. You can see them here at the picture, and under that another picture, maybe showing a little also something about the Danes. That is the welcome of the Danish Jews from Sweden coming back to Denmark, and there were a lot of people in the harbor welcoming them with the Danish flag. The lady standing to the left is my grandmother, the young lady is my mother, and they were welcomed by my father, who already had returned a day before. Now, I mentioned the two narratives. The Swedish narrative was challenged by a man, a very interesting person called Felix Kersten. He was some kind of a natural physician taking care of Himmler, very close to Himmler, and he said, listen, I was the one who persuaded Himmler to allow the rescue operation of the white buses. Those buses which were painted white, and on the top of the roof, the Red Cross was painted in order that the Royal Air Force pilots should be able to indicate them and not to bomb them. By the way, it didn't work out always. So Felix Kersten said, listen, some of the recognition is mine. And there were historians like the Dutch Postobus and the British Trevor Roberts said, listen, that's right. Bernadotte and the Swedes tried to take too much of the credit. Now, in the 80s, the criticism towards Sweden became bigger. It was mentioned in a book written by an American Jewish historian, Stephen Koplik, The Stones Cry Out. It was also translated to a number of languages. And he said, let me just remind the Swedes that you didn't allow all the Jewish refugees from Germany, Czechia, and Poland to enter Sweden just before and at the outbreak of World War II. By the way, the Danes neither not accepted all of them. About 1,500 refugees, Jewish refugees, were allowed to go into Denmark. The rest were turned down. The second thing, which was said or criticized about Sweden, was that Sweden had information about the Holocaust already in 1942. I can't go into the into details of the story with Gerstein, and they didn't publish it. The third thing was, listen, you are taking too much credit for the white buses. And the fourth thing is the flexible Swedish neutrality. Now, speaking about the white buses, and in order to understand what enabled this fantastic rescue of the Danish Jews in, I would say, one of the last days possible to rescue them, we have to understand that we are dealing with the second part of World War II, which means we are in 43, 44. In the end of 42 and in the beginning of 43, there's a turning on point in the World War. First of all, in the victory of Montgomery at El Alamein, and later on the victory of the Russians in Stalingrad. And it became now clear that the Germans were going to lose the war. However, Germany still holds more than 50 armored divisions in Europe. And Sweden had now to decide what is the next step to be taken. And let's understand what happened to Sweden. You can see here the map of Sweden. Sweden here is with the red or with the pink color. Sweden is pretty close to Russia. Russia here to the east, and pretty close to Germany in the south. And the Swedish policy, already in the 30s, and especially when at the outbreak of the war, was to stay out of the war, to be neutral. And we can call this a policy of Sweden, not only neutrality, but flexible neutrality, because the 3 first years, from 39 to almost to 43, Sweden was actually leaning toward Germany. Sweden had a great export of iron ore, which was so important for the German war industry. They sold ball bearings, also very important, ball bearings in what we call in Scandinavian and in German Kugellager, or in Beivrit Meisavim. We have to remember the Midsummer Crisis in 1941, when Sweden allowed the transit of an armored German division from Norway through Sweden to Finland. That is not exactly the way that a neutral country has to conduct its policy if it has declared neutrality. So now, after the turning on point in World War II, it was so important for Sweden to restore and rebuild its international image. It was a part of my doctoral thesis. I made research at archives in Washington, in London, in Germany, in Sweden and Norway and Denmark. And I saw the correspondence between especially Roosevelt and Churchill and British officials and American officials. They were very, very critical against Sweden, because Sweden was, in their opinion, too much leaning toward the German. By the way, I would like also I don't want to spoil the good atmosphere here, but I would like also to remind you that it was so important that the German action against the Jews had not taken place before 1943, before October, because it was in 1943 there was a shift in change in the Danish, should we call it, a public atmosphere, the strengthening of the resistance, the general strike, the resignation of the government, and that was something which enabled the rescue of the Danish Jews. Again, I don't want to be too critical, because as second generation of Danes who were rescued by Jewish Danes by the Danes, yes. But let's not forget that together with this great gratitude that we have to practice, there were Danes who collaborated and cooperated with the Germans who persecuted the Jews in October 1943. Denmark also turned down Jewish refugees, especially from Czech and from Germany. And let's not forget, we speak about the Danish resistance, and I have got all the respect. There were 6,000 members of the Danish resistance, but there was a double number, 12,000 Danes who were recruited, enlisted in the German security forces, including the Wehrmacht, and including the SS Waffen, and including 100 Danes who worked as SS personnel at the concentration camp. So let's have a little balance in it. I want to continue with the Swedes. I said for Sweden it was so important to restore and to rebuild its international image. Sweden also wanted to be a part of the rebuilding of Europe after the war. And it was decided by the Swedish government to recruit all the resources in humanitarian work through the Swedish Red Cross. Now, the president of the Swedish Red Cross was this tall guy standing to the right, Prince Carl. He was 90 years old. That's a little old to go out and work in the field. So his nephew, Bernadotte, Count Folke Bernadotte, was appointed as his, deputy. And already a few months after, I speak about October 1943, the Red Cross, led by Bernadotte, are in head of a big exchange operation. About 5,000 prisoners of war, Germans and English, were exchanged in the Swedish city harbor of Göteborg, and Bernadotte became a very famous person. Now, about a year after that, the same thing took place, a second exchange of prisoners, and Bernadotte, who really knew what was the idea of public relations, he became an international known personality. Now, the high point of the Swedish humanitarian activities was Operation White Buses in spring 1945. The Swedish headquarters was established in March at the outskirts of Hamburg at the castle of Friedrichsruh. And here we see the white buses. Now, the idea was to be ready to evacuate the Norwegian and the Danish concentration prisoners from Germany to Denmark or to Sweden or both. But they hadn't been allowed so far by the Germans. So the idea is, let's transfer them with the permission of the Germans to a concentration camp located in the north, close to Hamburg, and that was the concentration camp of Neuengamme. Now, I want to point out, we speak about the non-Jewish prisoners. We do not speak about the prisoners from Theresienstadt. It might seem terrible, but you have to understand those bloody Germans that in the end, when the permission was given to transfer, evacuate the Norwegians and the Danes to Neuengamme, it didn't include Jews. That the Germans could not agree to. Now, the personnel of the Swedes included a little more than 300 military volunteers, very reliable ambulance buses, 36 of them, 19 trucks, passengers cars, motorcycles, all operating on fuel, on benzene, and that was important because they had to go sometimes for long distance, and the roads were not very good. Now here we can see the concentration camp of Neuengamme, and we can see that it's pretty close to Hamburg. Now I want to show you the time schedule of Operation White Buses. Now, due to the fact that we're a little short of time, I'll not go into the details what happened every day, but you can see in the middle of March, the first section of the Swedish expedition reached Friedrichsruh Castle, close to Hamburg, and then they got the permission to start to transfer the Danes and the Norwegians to the Neuengamme camp. And later on, the Swedish Red Cross was allowed to enter the camp. They got a special section of the camp and to take care of the Scandinavian prisoners, both on the medical level and other levels. And again, being ready for the day or for the hour that they should be allowed to proceed to Denmark and Sweden. Now, please pay attention to what I have printed in red. On 5th of April, half of the Swedish rescue personnel returned to Sweden because they had a contract for 1 month, and they were replaced by Danes. The evacuation of the Jews from Theresienstadt take place from the 12th to the 18th April, which means half of the personnel at that time operating were Danish. it was before that the Danes and the Norwegian were evacuated from Neuengamme. Now, later on, there were evacuations also of the Jewish women, mainly from Ravensbrück. And again, when we as Israeli, and I think when we are here in Beit Theresienstadt, we have to remember that through this operation of the white buses, I think close to 7,000 Jews were rescued. The Danish Jews in Theresienstadt, and mainly the Jewish women from Ravensbrück. These are the concentration camps from which the Scandinavians were collected and brought to Neuengamme. Neuengamme is here in the north, not so far from the Danish border. And you can see here as they were collected from Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, Dachau, and every one of this concentration camp had also branches. Now, it was not an easy job, and we have to pay respect for the Swedes who did it, and also for the Danes. There were Gestapo officers escorting the white buses. There were SS liaison officers, and there were armored, also sometimes armored guards at the buses. Now, I would like to focus upon the rescue of the Danish Jews. We remember that not all the Danish Jews were lucky enough to flee to Sweden. 472 were deported to Theresienstadt, where they were joined by 10 other Jewish prisoners from Ravensbrück, altogether 482. Now, again, I don't want to spoil the atmosphere, but speaking about, on one hand, about the efforts of the general Danish public, and I do agree with what Orna said before, it was not only the resistance, it was also the simple man on the street, and the priest, and especially the medical teams, the nurses and the doctors. But let's not forget that there's also the back side of the coin. What you see here to the right is a timetable of a Danish train, specially ordered, and the actual train is what we call the Danske Statsbaner, transferring Jews from Helsingør in the north of Zealand to Copenhagen. So there was certain cooperation in persecuting the Jews in Denmark. Not everything in Denmark was 100% okay. Now, as Orna said, the parcel, the package, and I think also Carsten spoke about it, sent to the Jews by the Danes. And remember, there was no government. It was the board of the directors of the ministries that actually hold the Jews, the Danish Jews, alive. They got food, they got clothes, and the agreement with Eichmann that they wouldn't be transported to the east, meaning to Auschwitz, meaning to the death. Now, the rescue of the Danish Jews from Theresienstadt is different from the rest of the activities of white buses, because it's outside Germany. It's in Theresienstadt, it's in Bohemia, Bremen, and it's Jews. And it was not so obvious and so clear from the very beginning that the Danish Jews could be rescued with the white buses. Now, the leader of the Danish delegation, a man of outstanding character, it was a physician called Dr. Johannes Holm. He was in the field all the time, but he had also his connections with the headquarters in Berlin, as well as it has his connections to the officials in Copenhagen. And he approached Bernadotte. He had some cooperation with Bernadotte. Bernadotte and the Swedes wanted this to be a Swedish operation, and they tried not to, should we say, have the Danes in the front. However, Holm is approaching Bernadotte, and he said, "Listen, we have to rescue and to evacuate the Danes now, because if not, the battlefield is getting closer and closer to Prague and to Theresienstadt." And Bernadotte said, "I will discuss it with Schellenberg." Schellenberg was his counterpart in the SS. He was a general. He was the commander of the intelligence of the SS. And he came back and he said, "Listen, it's impossible." And Bernadotte was quite negative concerning the rescue of the Danish Jews. He has been accused later on for being anti-Semitic. I don't think he was. I think he was afraid that the operation on the macro level could collapse, and he didn't want to risk the whole operation in order to save the Danish Jews. So Holm approached the Danes, the official, and said, "Listen, let us carry it out as a pure Danish operation, and let's operate the Danish equipment, the Danish buses." I have to remind you, the Danish equipment was quite lousy. The buses were operated on what we called regas. In Danish, we call it gengas. And they were very slow, and we could doubt really if they were able to go from Hamburg and down to Theresienstadt and back again. So there was a conversation between Holm and the Swedish Captain Harald Folke, an outstanding Swedish officer who was so active in the whole operation. And Folke said, "Listen, you can't do it. You need our bosses." And he said, "I will recruit the bosses and I will go down to Prague with you, with 2 other officers." And that was, in the end, what was done. So it means that the equipment, the bosses were Swedish bosses. The personnel operating Swedish and Danes. But the political negotiations were held by Holm and by his associate, an SS officer called Heinz Reinau, and their counterpart in Berlin was mainly Kaltenbrunner and Müller. Bernadotte's counterpoint was Himmler and Schellenberg. And in the end, at the 12th of April, the convoy, including the crucial, so important Swedish buses and 3 officers, leave Frederiksruhe, leave the castle on the way to the south. And they just left. Then there came an order from Stockholm, "Stop it." But they didn't stop. At 13th of April, they passes Potsdam. On 14th of April, they reached Flossenburg. By the way, they had to take some 456 prominent German prisoners von Nine Game to Flossenburg. That was the order of the SS. They came to Flossenburg, but the commander there wouldn't receive them. So the French had to continue to Theresienstadt. They're arriving in Theresienstadt, picking up the Jews, as we just saw here in the movie, so I'm not going to repeat it. I just want to say that in the historical research, there's been raised a question if Bernadotte personally tried to obstruct the rescue of the Danish Jews. The first one to raise these allegations, and I have to say they are very, very extreme, was Dr. Johannes Holm, the man in the field, the commander in the field, in a book he published in the 80s. I would say most of the historians like Sole Madsen, who published a very important book about the white buses in 2005, take a little distance and listen, you are exaggerating. One of the things, one of the items or issues against Bernadotte was that he was supposed to have told some stories, improper stories about Jews during the expedition and rescue operation of the white Jews. I went a little into the depths. I had the opportunity of meeting those people who were in charge, both in the field and also the officials, the Denmark directors of the ministries like Henrik Koch. And they said, it's right, he told the story, but don't consider him as anti-Semitic. And that was not the reason that he was opposing the rescue of the Danish Jews from Theresienstadt. Speaking about the Danish Jews in Theresienstadt, we have thanked all the time the Danes. I would like just to mention also a suite of outstanding character. Gustav Engel, he was the director of the juridical department of the foreign ministry in Stockholm. And not so many people, only those who are really dealing with the historic details, know his personal part of the rescue of the Danish Jews, also the rescue during October, but also in Theresienstadt. The Jews leave Theresienstadt in 45. The convoy crossed Dresden and Potsdam. They saw the horrible ruins of Potsdam. They were not allowed, that maybe that was their luck. They were not allowed into Neuengamme. They had to go straight to Denmark. And then via the Danish cities, Haderslev, Odense, on the 17th, they come to Denmark, go to Copenhagen, by a sidewalk to the ferry and to Malmö. I would like just to mention a few small things in order to be able to understand this special atmosphere. We saw at the movie how the Danes were informed that they were going to leave Theresienstadt, and how they, during that day, it was a Friday, and during the Sabbath, they were so in tension because they were afraid maybe they would be deported to the east. And then first of all, Holm, the physician, is showing up in a car together with the SS officer, and he said, listen, now the buses are coming, and they saw the Swedish Red Cross buses. And then they got ready. And then there was a question, because you see, there were about 423 Jews left alive. A little more than 50 passed away. And the leader of the could you call it the Jewish community, or the Jews in Theresienstadt, was Rabbi Max Friediger. He was the chief rabbi of Denmark. And there were some of the Danes who had partners, which this was not a concentration camp, it was a ghetto. So they had, there were some of the Danish young men who had Jewish girlfriends, not Danish. And there was also the opposite. And the question was, what do we do with these young girls and men? And Rabbi Friediger, he said, I'm the one who takes the decision. He decided, where were we speaking about a relationship which was serious? And those who were serious, he married them. He made the chuppah kedusha on the spot. and they were allowed to join the rescue to, first of all, to Denmark and then to Sweden. We saw before the lighting of the Hanukkah candles by the grandchild of Robert Fischermann. Robert Fischermann was 15 years old when he was an inmate in Theresienstadt, when he was taken together with his brother, 2 sisters, and his mother. The family was split up because the father and the older brother and the older sister managed to flee. And he wrote a book about it. I had the honor to be the historical advisor of this book. And here's one of the persons coming back with the white buses. And now you understand what's happening. He's coming to Sweden. And the Jews from Theresienstadt are meeting. They are reunited with their families, with their friends that they haven't seen for a year and a half. And he didn't know, and his mother didn't know, what had happened to his father and to his brother. But his father and his brother drowned when the wooden boat that they tried to flee from the coast of Zealand to Sweden turned over. So again, the joy, the happiness of being in Sweden and to be again a released person, a free person, was mixed also with tragedies. I mentioned before the Ravensbrück evacuation. I would like to conclude with with 2 remarks. One is about Bernadotte. And that is actually the conclusions also of my doctoral thesis. Bernadotte had 4 meetings from February to April with Himmler. And I think that without these 4 meetings and his negotiations, the whole operation would have been carried out in a much smaller scale, as the Danes did before the Swedes and before Bernadotte came into the picture. However, Bernadotte was not dealing only with the rescue of the Scandinavians. He was also trying to mediate between the allies, between America and England and Himmler, because the crazy idea of Himmler, and that was actually one of the reasons that Himmler allowed the Operation White Buses to take place. And it was not an original idea of Himmler. It was a plan which came up by his advisor, the SS General Walter Schellenberg. And what he said was, we will capitulate only to the Western powers, and we'll open our roads, and you will push forward from the west to the east, and then there will come the big clash with the communists, with the Red Army. Now, that was, I think it was not only a stupid, it was an idea which was impossible, because the Allies would never agree to that. However, he provided Bernadotte on the 24th of April, on their last meeting, with this letter of attorney that he actually tried to mediate and to suggest that we will give up, but only to the Americans and to the English. And it was handed over to by Stockholm to Churchill. Churchill immediately informed the Russians, and which means he jeopardized the idea on the spot, and he also informed the Swedes that they were not interested in their mediation. However, as conclusion, two conclusion remarks. The first of all, without the Swedes and without Bernadotte, the whole affair, the whole rescue operation of white buses, including also the rescue of the Danish Jews, would not have been possible. We have to remember that we are dealing with the bloody Nazis, and for them to negotiate with a Swede who is expressing self-confidence, I refer, of course, to Bernadotte, who is a member of the royal family, who's always wearing a uniform. That was the way the Germans could negotiate. And therefore, the importance of the Swedes were both the negotiations with Himmler as well as the outstanding Swedish equipment and the Swedish military personnel. Now, the leaders here of Beit Theresienstadt, when they began this conference, they referred to the time period that we are going through in Israel in these days. I would like to join them. I agree to every word. I would like just to tell you that I'm the head of the Department of Social Science in the Academic College of Ashkelon. 18 of our students were killed during the battles. 17 of them, many of them policemen who are studying for an academic degree, many of them were killed in battle on the 7th of December and the 8th of December, because those students were the first ones to go out and confrontate those murderous terrorists. So I join your hope that we'll see better times and more joyful times in Israel. And again, if I raise the question about the two countries, Denmark and Sweden, and I spoke also, I asked the question, to whom do we have to pay our respect and gratitude? I think we have to be thankful both to Denmark and to Sweden. Thank you for your attention.
הגענו לגבול בין גרמניה ודנמרק, ושם הייתה לנו הפתעה. קודם כל, בשני צדדים של הכבישים עמדו דנים עם הדגלים של דנמרק, והם צעקו אלינו, Welcome home. אני לא אשכח את זה בחיים שלי. פתחנו את החלונות, הם זרקו לנו כל מיני דברים טובים. וכל הדרך הם עמדו שם. בגבול החייל הגרמני יצא, וכך הגענו לעיר אונסה, איפה שהנס כריסטיאן אנדרסן נולד.
We have reached the end of the event. Thank you all for being with us. And we wish you all happy Hanukkah. And we hope that a peaceful day will come and all hostages and soldiers will return home safely to their loved ones. Good evening and thank you for being with us.